Tonight, protests swell, but riots subside in the US, while a family remembers the man whose death ignited a nation's anger.
I want justice for him because he was good.
Also tonight, it's official. Australia falls into recession for the first time in 3 decades. A judge rages at the 2 young men who stabbed drug lord Tony Mockbell.
You will end up drug-rattled, lonely old men.
And hot off the presses, Horsham leads the way with a new local paper. Good evening, Mary Gearin with ABC News. Thousands of protesters have again taken to the streets across America, defying curfews for an 8th night. But the demonstrations are now largely peaceful, even as the anger over the death of George Floyd continues. After Donald Trump threatened to bring in the military, the Pentagon has moved about 1,600 troops to be on standby outside Washington. There's anger over the president's response to the protests, but many Americans support his pitch to restore law and order. George Floyd's family has joined demonstrators in Houston, and in emotive scenes, the mother of his daughter has called for justice. From Washington, North America correspondent David Lipson begins our coverage.
In America's capital, they marched on the Lincoln Memorial and were met by the National Guard. In Portland, thousands lay face down on a bridge to remember today's icon of black justice, George Floyd. All over America, countless thousands made their voices heard peacefully.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Even cowboys in Texas turned out for the cause.
I'm here today so she doesn't have to come back in 15 years for the same issue and protest again. So we want it fixed now.
Keep going. Keep going.
For those in charge, the first priority is restoring law and order. A looting free-for-all in New York last night drew harsh words from the governor.
The NYPD and the mayor did not do their job last night.
Welcome to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. You're not burning down our city.
While in Idaho, locals were taking security into their own hands. The self-proclaimed law and order president stood for the cameras before a papal statue, but the presidential motorcade was booed as it returned to the White House. The clearing out of peaceful protesters for yesterday's photo opportunity has caused widespread outrage. Even ardent supporters of the president had blunt advice.
Seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain. I want to comfort you. I think it's time we love each other. But the president took a different course.
Others saw it as a show of strength in a time of need.
It was strong and powerful for the president to go there and say, we will not be cowed.
The protest movement is getting political.
I promise you this, I won't traffic in fear and division. I won't fan the flames of hate.
Well, it may not look like it from what you can see here and at other protests around the country, but Donald Trump still enjoys a lot of support, particularly in the states that matter.
Black Lives Matter!
Even here, there are doubts about his opponent.
Would like to see him out of the White House, of course. But then again, I don't know who else is going to be going in the White House next. Could be somebody worse than Donald Trump.
As night drew on, there were more clashes at the White House and arrests in New York. The rage hasn't burned out just yet. David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
In Minneapolis, the mother of George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter told the crowd he was a good man. And the state's governor has announced a human rights investigation into the entire Minneapolis Police Department. Chief Foreign Correspondent Philip Williams reports.
Gianna Floyd, just 6 years old, her father taken from her under the weight of a police knee.
This is what those officers took.
Gianna's mother, Roxy Washington, was mourning a future lost for a child and her father.
He would never see her grow up, graduate. He would never walk her down the aisle.
Her dad gone, his memory, his name, now etched in American history.
George Floyd! George Floyd!
Across the nation, countless thousands heeded the family's call for peaceful protests.
The families asked everybody to take a breath, just to take a breath for peace, take a breath for justice.
The Minnesota Human Rights Department has launched a civil rights investigation into Minneapolis police.
We're going to establish peace on our streets when we address the systemic issues that caused it in the first place.
The state's governor is resisting calls from the president to send in even more National Guard troops. And from the Minnesota National Guard itself, a promise to heed the call from protesters to keep it low-key.
We heard it, and we're going to stay back behind, invisible, so that you can't see us. Is that okay? Yeah, thank you.
That sense of cooperation between the protesters and the authorities has been seen in a number of cities.
Thank you!
But lurking amongst the thousands mobilising around the country is an unseen enemy. The risk of COVID-19 silently spreading through the crowds is frighteningly real.
I worry terribly about the peaceful protests. I see some wearing masks. I see some others not wearing masks.
One man's brutal death, one way or another, could cost many more lives in the weeks ahead. Philip Williams, ABC News.
The Black Lives Matter movement is growing in Australia with a large protest planned for Melbourne this weekend. It's a challenge for authorities trying to contain the coronavirus and maintain physical distancing. But with a big crowd on the cards, police won't be issuing fines. The opposition says that is a double standard. Here's state political reporter Richard Willingham.
From the streets of the US to Sydney and across to Western Australia, Australia's Black Lives Matter campaign is growing. On Saturday, Victorians will take to the streets, but with potentially thousands of people attending, it's a dilemma for authorities trying to contain coronavirus.
The risk of participation in a mass gathering in and of itself generates a significant risk of community-based transmission.
The organisers of the rally are being very clear about the rules so that people can maintain safe distance from one another, that people are being encouraged to wear masks.
The big crowd means police won't fine those breaking coronavirus rules, but troublemakers are on notice.
The only form of legitimate protest is a peaceful protest, and Victoria Police will not tolerate violence. They will not tolerate that kind of some of the disorder that we've seen overseas.
The Premier hasn't tried to stop the event yet. A mass gathering protest like this is a nightmare scenario for a government trying to contain COVID-19 in the face of criticism over its tough restrictions. It also doesn't want to quash a progressive movement that's growing in voice.
Well, it's total hypocrisy, isn't it? And what's more, it's a mess.
After police restricted a rally yesterday against a cull of Brumbies, one Liberal backbencher said that Brumby lives matter too.
Brumby Lives Matter has been a term being used for quite some time. Way before I heard of the term Black Lives Matter.
I think that those comments are racist, purely racist. We have a real opportunity here, I think, to bring this country together, and it's poor comments like that that really set us back.
Reform takes time. The death of Yorta Yorta woman Tanya Day in a police cell prompted the state coroner to recommend scrapping public drunkenness offences. In August last year, the Attorney General promised to do it. She's now hopeful the law can be changed by the end of the year.
We need to have some designated public health services where people are able to be supported, and that a police cell is not the place, it's not safe.
Richard Willingham, ABC News, Melbourne.
The family of an Aboriginal teenager has called for the Sydney police officer who forcibly tripped him to the ground to be charged. An internal police investigation is underway after this video emerged showing the 16-year-old having his legs swept out from underneath him. Today, the boy's family knelt in solidarity with US protests, and his sister says the constable's actions were out of line.
The use of excessive force used upon him is unnecessary and irresponsible, especially the need to leg sweep somebody who was not a threat and resisting was dangerous and uncalled for.
The family says it highlights the treatment Indigenous people have been experiencing for years when cameras weren't there. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Australia is entering a recession, ending a dream run of economic growth that began in the Hawke-Keating era. And with hundreds of thousands of Australians still out of work, the Federal Treasurer's warned the worst is yet to come. Political editor Andrew Probyn begins our coverage.
29 years after the recession we had to have comes the one we couldn't avoid.
Is Australia in recession today?
The answer to that is yes.
Josh Frydenberg didn't utter the R word, instead painting the grimmest of pictures.
This was the Economist's version of Armageddon.
In the first 3 months of the year, Australia's economy shrank by 0.3%, the first negative quarter since 2011. The year-on-year result, the weakest since the global financial crisis. The March quarter had it all.
Flood, fire, drought, and now the coronavirus pandemic.
The education and tourism sectors were struck first by COVID-19 when arrivals from China were banned in February. Tougher distancing restrictions in March forced the closure of pubs, cafes, restaurants and some shops. Panic buying at supermarkets didn't stop household spending plummeting.
Massive drop. Transport, hotels, cafes.
Australia's done well when you look overseas. Japan's contraction 3 times bigger. The United States economy down 1.3%, the UK 2%. Italy and France, which were also hit hard by COVID-19, both shrank by more than 5%, almost double that in China, where the virus first struck. But today's figures don't reflect the economic horror many are experiencing. The current quarter will be awful.
Far more severe than what we have seen today. But it's really a consumption story.
Treasury's expecting the economy to shrink 10% in the June quarter, bringing almost 3 decades of uninterrupted growth to a shocking stop.
This long run of growth was created by Hawke and Keating, it was defended by Rudd and Swan, and it ends under Morrison and Frydenberg.
Many Australians already know the brutal reality of this recession, and with unemployment to remain painfully high for quite some time, creating jobs will remain a challenge long after the pandemic has passed. To that end, employers and unions today held the first of several meetings to see if they can agree on how workplace laws can be changed to make that easier.
We all have to come into this process and be willing to make compromises.
We're going to approach it with an open mind. We're going to approach it in good faith.
A new era of consensus? Too early to tell. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
It was the slump in spending from Australians that really hit the economy hard, and saving rates also increased even as millions of people turned to government support. Here's finance correspondent Philip Lasker.
Kylie Gemmell and her partner Trent Glass were living their dream in regional New South Wales. But that turned into a nightmare when their accommodation business was hit by the drought, then bushfires and now the lockdown.
The tap was literally just turned off.
This year's income is zero.
As a business, it's definitely very worrying, and to be quite honest, I don't think that any business could have planned for the succession of disasters that we've had.
The economy was already pretty weak coming into 2020.
From mid-March, the pandemic and lockdowns pushed the economy off a cliff. Spending on services like travel, accommodation and hospitality plunged, while people panic-bought food and groceries. The savings rate rose sharply. Australians were scared or simply unable to spend as the economy shut down. Business and housing investment was subdued, highlighting concerns about construction jobs. Supporting the economy was government spending, triggered by the support payments needed following the natural disasters and lockdown. Trade was also a positive because our exports proved more resilient than imports, which fell sharply because the economy was so weak. These numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. 600,000 people have been thrown out of work and a large part of the private sector is on its knees. It means government support will need to remain in place for some time to come.
elevated debt levels, low productivity, weak wages. All of that's still there when we come out.
Kylie Gemmell is hoping the worst is over as restrictions are eased.
People were just desperate to get away. I think everyone was sick of being in lockdown, and our bookings have been strong.
What could possibly go wrong? Philip Lasker, ABC News.
Australian universities are stepping up their campaign for a taxpayer bailout, releasing their own modelling that indicates they face a $16 billion revenue hit by 2023. And the unis say that will cripple research that could spearhead the post-COVID economic recovery. But the federal government isn't going beyond the modest relief package announced 2 months ago. National Education reporter Connor Duffy reports.
Professor Hala Zirakat is a leading biomedical engineer. The Harvard Fellow manufactures bone and tissue when the body can't do the job itself.
We're bringing talents to Australia who eventually will stay in Australia, contribute to the progress of innovation and economy in Australia.
Research like this has been bankrolled by revenue from international students and helped Australian unis soar in global rankings. The pandemic has forced a change in direction.
Moving away from research because there isn't that job security.
The decade of record revenue from overseas students meant the major players entered the crisis with billion-dollar reserves. Now even the richest unis are bracing to make big cuts, warning economic growth will be a casualty.
Are we going to downsize it, de-skill Australians and not have emerging high-tech companies that power our economy?
ANU's chief, Brian Schmidt, is an astrophysicist awarded a Nobel Prize for discoveries about the universe. The next generation's horizons could be more limited.
Australia will just find itself a less wealthier place.
The universities with the weakest balance sheets, generally regional and suburban campuses, are negotiating with banks and fighting to keep jobs.
It's never a pleasant thing to ask your staff to take a reduction in their pay, and we don't do it lightly.
Central Queensland University and Geelong's Deakin University have already laid off staff, while Melbourne's La Trobe searches for answers.
We've instituted savings measures of about $80 million already this year.
Universities are desperate for extra cash, but the government is defending current funding levels. And there's a view the onus should be on Vice-Chancellors, who often earn seven-figure salaries, to fix their fragile business models. Connor Duffy, ABC News.
7 more people in Victoria have tested positive for coronavirus. 6 of them are returned travellers in hotel quarantine. And in Japan, there's been a spike of cases in Tokyo a week after a state of emergency was lifted. The city's governor issued an alert as the Japanese capital recorded 34 new cases in the last 24 hours. It's a marked increase from late May, when infections had slowed to just a few per day. About a third of the cases are linked to bars and nightclubs. That makes contact tracing much harder. The Tokyo alert means if infections continue to rise, residents could be again asked to avoid non-essential outings. Still to come this hour, how the recession is forcing people to move back in with their parents.
The business that I own stopped 100%, so no income, which is difficult.
It's evolved our relationship from being one where it's sort of parent and child to being on the same level.
The noise factor, the privacy factor, how does all that work? And every family will be different.
Plus, meet the Australians caught in America's protests. That's coming up.
A Melbourne judge has blasted 2 young men as she sentenced them to 10 years behind bars for attacking drug lord Tony Mockbell in jail. Tira Bennett and Eldea Tuera are already serving time for serious violent offending. And a warning, this report by Danny Tran contains some distressing images.
With a cell-sharpened shiv, Tony Mockbell was viciously stabbed up to 7 times by Tira Bennett and Eldea Tuera, members of the powerful Pacific Islander prison gang, GFAM.
When you're 40, you see what GFAM and the bros do for you. You've never had a job, never had a stable relationship, no relationships with the children that you have. You will end up drug-rattled, lonely old men.
In February last year, a story about Mockbell, who's currently serving a 30-year sentence for drug trafficking, appeared in the Herald Sun, calling him an enforcer and saying he'd busted a Pacific Island extortion racket. The next day, in the moments after Bennett's own birthday party in the prison yard, he and Twerra made their move, armed with crude prison-made knives, pouncing on Mockbell and another prisoner who tried to intervene.
The only reason you are getting any attention is because it was Tony Mockbell. But at the end of the day, you two young blokes, 2-on-1, mauled and maimed a 53-year-old man.
The ferocious stabbing left Mockbell clinging to life, and he was rushed to hospital for emergency brain surgery.
And you may think you're heroes within the jail, but do you think in 20 years' time that's going to matter?
Even though they dragged him to the brink of death, Tony Mockbell declined to give a statement to police, as did the men who stabbed him. Bennett and Twerra were today sentenced to 10 years behind bars, where they're already serving time for serious violent crimes. And when he finishes his sentence, Bennett will probably be deported to New Zealand. Danny Tran, ABC News, Melbourne.
The partner of a woman who was found dead in the middle of Melbourne last year has now pleaded guilty to her murder. Natalina Ungok's body was found in Chinatown in April. In December, Christopher Allen Bell pleaded not guilty to murdering the 32-year-old Geelong woman, today changing his plea. The pair had been in a relationship for 18 months. Bell will be sentenced at a later date. Well, while regional newspapers across the country are closing at a rapid rate, some small family-run publishers are finding ways to survive and even expand during the pandemic. The Horsham Times in Western Victoria published its first issue last week, and its owner believes the community-run business model could be the way forward for Australia's regional press.
It was a first edition that made its own headlines. A day after News Corp became the latest major media company to stop printing many of its suburban and regional papers, the first edition of the new Horsham Times hit the newsagent's shelves.
The newsagent at Horsham was beaming from ear to ear because he hadn't had that many customers in the newsagent for probably nearly 2 months.
David Ward and his family have been publishing in Victoria's West for 5 generations.
My grandfather, George Ward, then operated the Horsham Times until, I believe, 1959.
Since the COVID-19 restrictions were put in place, large media companies have deserted country towns, throwing the future of regional print media in doubt. But David Ward believes it could create an opportunity for country newspapers to return to being owned and operated from within their communities.
We've been going for 135 years this year. I would deem it fairly poor form not to continue publishing a paper.
Other family-run newspapers are also finding ways to hang on during the pandemic.
We made some pretty tough choices early and decided that being open for the community was really important to us.
It's not that people don't want news and information anymore, it's not the product that's the problem, it's the business model.
At a time where regional communities are desperate for local updates on a global pandemic, the passion of small publishers to continue printing is great news for regional Victorians.
So many people out here rely on a newspaper and just they can't get their news online.
As long as there are stories to be told, it doesn't look like these presses will be stopped anytime soon. Sean Wales, ABC News, Horsham.
Good news indeed. Returning to finance now, and the markets shrugged off the news that Australia is in recession, with strong gains by both shares and the dollar. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, the markets have known for months that Australia would have a recession this year, so no surprise there. Today's action was a continuation of the view that the recovery will look like a V, which is what the Australian dollar chart looks like. The trade-weighted index is all the way back to where it was in January, which is 69.5 US cents and 62 euro cents. In fact, at one stage today, the exchange rate was nudging 70 US cents. Now, there are two specific reasons the dollar is rising. The iron ore price is up more than 20% in a month, and the US dollar is falling. More broadly, it's about optimism, which means all risk assets are booming, and that includes shares as well as the Aussie dollar, because global investors reckon it's all going to be okay. The All Ordinaries Index went above 6,000 today, led mainly by the banks, and beaten up stocks like Qantas. The buy now, pay later firm Zipco went up another 22%, making it 67% in 2 days after it bought an American rival. And a little company named FBR, which stands for Fast Brick Robotics, went up 32% today after reporting that its bricklaying robot is now laying 200 bricks an hour, which is about twice what your average human bricklayer can do, apparently. Global markets were all higher last night and today. The iron ore price reversed 1% last night, while oil jumped 3.7%. And finally, here's a graph of per capita GDP, which removes the effect of population growth. It fell 0.7% in the March quarter, more than twice the fall in total GDP, and it's been in trend decline for decades. And that's finance.
Two of Melbourne's football leagues have announced they've cancelled their senior competitions this year. The Northern and Eastern football leagues won't have men's, women's or under-19s comps. They say it's the only option to ensure the long-term viability of their clubs. Both leagues will still try to run junior competitions this year. Fremantle says it doesn't know why forward Cam McCarthy collapsed during this morning's non-contact training session. McCarthy was taking part in a drill with a small group of teammates when he collapsed before walking to an ambulance and being taken to hospital. Dockers coach Justin Longmuir says it's too early to know if the 25-year-old will travel to the Gold Coast next week.
Our mind is on Cam's health and well-being. We'll work out what it means for the hub and you know what that looks like going forward after we get the medical recommendations.
The Dockers fly to Queensland on Tuesday before their round 2 match against Brisbane. Brisbane Lions teammates Simon Black and Jonathan Brown have been inducted into the Australian Football Hall of Fame. The duo played a crucial part in the Lions' famous three-peat from 2001 to 2003. Black won the Norm Smith Medal in the 2003 Grand Final win over Collingwood and says the performance is the most memorable of his career.
It's probably the most calm and relaxed and in tune with the game I've ever been. You talk about, I guess, being in the zone, and that's probably one of the most I've ever felt. Just the game came to me rather than having to feel like I had to push too hard.
Black and Brown join their teammates Michael Voss, Jason Ackermanis and Nigel Lappin in the exclusive Hall of Fame club. And now it's time for weather. Here's James Hancock.
Mary, I hope you got to enjoy a little sun under today's mostly cloud-covered skies. It was a relatively warm night across the state. Minimums were above average by up to 5 degrees, but -2 there for Bulla. A cold front swept through in the early hours of the morning. The most rain fell at Moe in the Latrobe Valley, getting 15 millimetres. Ferny Creek on Melbourne's eastern edge, recording 13 millimetres. Today it was mostly cloudy, but skies cleared in the north this afternoon. In the state's east, 3 millimetres of rain fell at Mount Wellington and 2 at Malakuta. Our low of 11 degrees was followed by a top of 14 around midday. Right now outside sitting on 12 degrees. Interstate today warm along the east coast and Perth in the 20s as well. On the satellite, a cold front has moved into the Tasman Sea. Behind it, there's a trough which is pushing cloud over our state, but a large part of the country is cloud-free under a strong high-pressure system. The high will slide towards Victoria's southwest tonight. It'll cross the state tomorrow and stop over the northeast on Friday. By the evening, a cold front that you can see there will move in, bringing showers to southern parts of the state on the weekend. Tomorrow, the state's far east can expect isolated showers. Interstate tomorrow, partly cloudy for Brisbane and also Sydney. Freezing to begin with in Canberra. A foggy and frosty start to the day for some tomorrow, but plenty of sunshine through the west. Mildura, Swan Hill and Oyen all heading for 15 degrees. To the east, there's a strong wind warning for the East Gippsland coast and severe morning frost is forecast for the northeast and ranges. Wangaratta, -2. So there's a frost warning. That's for parts of the Wimmera, Northern Country, North Central, Northeast and Southwest forecast districts. On the bays, winds will be variable, about 10 knots. Partly cloudy tonight in Melbourne with light southerly winds. Tomorrow, areas of morning fog, mostly sunny in the afternoon. Down to 6 before a top of 14 degrees tomorrow. Looking ahead, mostly sunny on Friday. Saturday, a shower or two is forecast and 13. Sunday is looking the same. For Monday, partly cloudy, 13. Tuesday, mostly sunny and 14 degrees. Mary.
Thanks, James. And that's it for this evening's bulletin. Lee Sales is up next with 7:30.